What happened when an undercover CEO traded his polished boardroom for a dusty electronics store floor and witnessed a single act of compassion that exposed everything wrong and right about his company? This is the story of Victor Leung, a tech executive who went undercover to investigate rising customer complaints and toxic management. What he found wasn't just mismanagement, but a culture on the edge. Until one quiet employee, Noah, offered a grieving widow more than just technical help. He offered humanity. That moment changed everything. Stay with us, because this story proves leadership starts with listening and showing up when it counts. Victor Langston sat in his 10th floor office, surrounded by floor-to-ceiling windows and walls lined with accolades for excellence in property management. Yet none of it comforted him as he reread the latest tenant complaint from Building E of Halston Heights, a once prized residential complex now riddled with issues. Maintenance delays, dismissive staff, safety concerns. He'd seen similar reports before, but this one stung. A handwritten letter from a grieving widow described how she was brushed off by a staff member when asking if there was a quiet place to sit after her husband's funeral. "He was my home," she wrote. "Now I don't even feel like I have a hallway to cry in." Victor stared at the line until the words blurred. He'd tried to manage the company with structure, performance metrics, quarterly reports, digital dashboards. From his perch in the executive tower, everything had looked adequate. Until lately. Over the past year, complaints had increased, and turnover among janitorial and on-site staff had quietly doubled. His regional directors chalked it up to labor shortages and tenant entitlement. But Victor wasn't convinced. He thought of his father, who built Clearwell from a 2-building operation and used to say, "If you don't know your people, you don't know your business." Victor had drifted too far from that philosophy. The polished reports couldn't show what was happening in the break rooms, the service closets, or the eyes of a young employee forced to cover 3 roles in one shift. It wasn't enough to send another survey. He needed to see, to feel what his employees felt, quietly, without press or protocol. Just a man in a hoodie with a mop and a name tag that read, Vince. That afternoon he closed his laptop, slid his phone into a drawer, and wrote 2 words on the whiteboard behind his desk in bold blue marker: "Go in." The message wasn't for anyone else. It was for him. It was time to walk into his own building and face what he'd ignored for too long. Victor Langston had worn tailored suits for so long that pulling on a faded maintenance polo felt like slipping into another life. He'd shaved his salt and pepper beard, trimmed his hair close to the scalp, and swapped his polished Oxfords for creased work boots he'd once used on weekend charity builds. His name tag read Vince L., and his backstory was simple. Recently laid off from a landscaping job, picking up temp work through the property's subcontracted maintenance agency. With the help of a discreet friend in HR, he was placed into a rotating maintenance schedule under a third-party vendor where on-site management wouldn't look twice. The uniform was standard: gray shirt, cargo pants, and a tool belt with half-bent screwdrivers and a faded multi-tool. No one from the building staff had ever met him, and even the property manager had only been with Clearwell for 6 months. It was the perfect storm of scale and disconnection. Victor knew that being invisible was the only way to hear the truth. He wouldn't be leading a town hall or shadowing supervisors. He'd be unclogging sinks, hauling trash bags, and fixing loose stair railings, right alongside the people whose voices had long been muffled beneath layers of management filters. He practiced answering to Vince in the mirror, deadpanning responses to questions about his experience, his back injury, and whether he planned to stick around. He didn't need long, just enough time to understand what had gone wrong at Halston Heights, and if he did it right, no one would know the CEO was walking through the service corridors. Not until it mattered. Victor's first shift at Halston Heights began in the dim basement service corridor, the air thick with dust and the hum of overworked machinery. The break room was cramped, fluorescent lights flickering overhead, vending machines buzzing in the corner. No one looked up when he walked in. A middle-aged man with grease-streaked hands handed him a mop and muttered, "Elevator leak, south stairwell. Hope you like stairs." That was Pete, the unofficial leader of the maintenance crew, who ran things with a tired shrug and a rotating playlist of classic rock. Victor set to work quietly, navigating the maze of boiler rooms and trash chutes. Within an hour, he began noticing the signs: water-damaged drywall near tenant laundry rooms, broken security lights that buzzed but never lit, and ceiling vents thick with lint that hadn't been touched in months. At lunch, he shared a bench with a woman named Carla, head of housekeeping, who glanced at him with a mix of suspicion and sympathy. "If you're here to fix things, good luck. We've been running with 2 fewer people since February and still get blamed for missed requests," she said, biting into a granola bar. No one lingered in the break room. There was no laughter, no ease, just glances at the clock and silent shuffling of worn-out shoes. Later, Victor offered to help an overwhelmed porter struggling with a cart full of overstuffed trash bags. "Thanks," the younger man said, breathing hard. "That elevator's been out since last week." Beth said it's not urgent. She's only urgent when a corporation shows up. Victor didn't respond, just took a bag and followed him up the back stairwell. By the end of the shift, he wasn't just sweating, he was simmering. The building wasn't falling apart due to budget cuts. It was the result of ignored problems, overworked staff, and a culture where exhaustion was expected but never addressed, and no one seemed to be listening. Until now. It was just after 3 p.m. when Victor noticed her. She stood in the lobby near the tenant directory, small-framed, silver hair pulled back into a neat twist, and a soft canvas bag dangling from her arm. She looked lost, turning the directory page slowly, as if hoping for a different result each time. Most residents brushed past her. The concierge desk sat empty and no one offered help. Victor, pushing a bucket from Elite Cleanup, paused near the pillar, watching. After a moment's hesitation, he walked over. "Can I help you find someone, ma'am?" he asked gently. The woman looked up, startled, then nodded slowly. "My husband used to live here. He passed away last month," she said, her voice trembling. "I just wanted to visit the rooftop garden. He loved it there." Victor glanced around. The rooftop was supposed to be for current residents only, and management was strict, especially Beth. But one look at the woman's eyes told him rules weren't the point today. "Come on," he said softly. "Elevators this way." He led her past the out-of-order service lift to the older resident access elevator, keying in a code he'd seen Pete use. On the ride up, she whispered, "No one's really spoken to me since the funeral. Not like I matter." Victor didn't know what to say, so he just kept standing beside her. The rooftop was quiet, the breeze warm with late summer air. She walked slowly between the flower beds, her fingers trailing over the thyme and rosemary, her eyes glistening. Victor stayed by the door, giving her space. 10 minutes passed before he saw her sit on a bench, take something from her bag, a framed photo, and place it gently on the seat beside her. From below, Beth's voice screeched through the radio clipped to Victor's belt. "Where the hell are you? South hallway's flooded." Victor pressed the button, but didn't respond. Not yet. He turned his attention back to the widow, watching as she whispered something to the wind. That moment, soft, human, ignored by everyone else, was what finally broke something loose in him. This building didn't just need maintenance. It needed someone to give a damn. The hours after the widow's visit were a blur of leaking pipes and overflowing garbage bins, but Victor's mind kept circling back to the rooftop. No one else had noticed her, no one else had cared, and yet Elijah, still fresh-faced and juggling tasks beyond his role, had dropped everything to help without hesitation. That wasn't in his job description. It wasn't something he'd get recognition for, but Victor had seen enough that week to know this wasn't a one-time act. Over the next few days, Victor quietly observed Elijah more closely. While others grumbled about supply shortages or ignored calls from tenants, Elijah moved with quiet urgency. When the elevator jammed with an elderly resident inside, he didn't wait for maintenance. He pried the doors open himself and reassured the woman until help arrived. When a delivery driver dropped an entire case of bottled water near the loading dock, Elijah was the only one who bent down to help gather them, not for praise, just instinct. He also noticed how the others treated him, with indifference, sometimes dismissal. Beth, in particular, had a sharp tongue ready for every minor delay. "Move faster," she'd snap, even as Elijah carried twice his load. And still, Elijah never pushed back. He just nodded, kept working, and picked up the slack without complaint. One evening, while mopping a stairwell, Victor found Elijah rewiring a loose light fixture with tools borrowed from the janitor's closet. "That's not your job," Victor said quietly. Elijah shrugged. "Yeah, but someone's going to trip if it stays that way." It wasn't a speech. It wasn't a moment of grand defiance. But in that quiet statement, Victor saw the difference. Elijah wasn't waiting for permission to care. He just did. In a place where most had grown numb, Elijah still chose to act. He didn't lead with volume or bravado. He led by noticing the things no one else did and doing something about them. That, Victor realized, was the kind of leadership this building had been missing for years. It happened during a particularly chaotic Friday afternoon. The copy machine had jammed again. 3 tenants were clustered outside the leasing office complaining about unresolved maintenance tickets, and the front phone rang off the hook. Beth stood at the center of it all, not managing, just barking orders and assigning blame. "Elijah, why isn't the hallway on 3B cleaned yet?" she snapped without looking up. "Do you think I pay you to walk around smiling at old ladies?" Elijah paused, mid-swipe on the counter, visibly biting back a reply. Victor had been standing by the stairwell entrance, unnoticed, watching it all unfold. He saw Elijah's shoulders stiffen and his hands curl into fists. Before the young man could answer, Victor stepped forward. "Beth," he said calmly, "we need to talk." Beth turned, her mouth already forming a retort, but stopped short when she got a good look at him. The glasses were gone. The hoodie was replaced with a fitted jacket. The air around him had shifted. "Who?" "My name is Victor Langston," he said clearly. "I'm the owner of Langston Properties, and I've been working here undercover for the past 2 weeks." The silence that fell over the lobby was instant and sharp. The tenants glanced up. One receptionist froze mid-call. Elijah turned slowly, confusion written all over his face. "I've been watching everything," Victor continued, "and what I've seen, your behavior, the way you speak to staff, the way you dismiss residents, doesn't reflect the company my father built, or the one I intend to run moving forward." Beth's face flushed. "You don't understand the pressure down here." "I understand it well," Victor interrupted. "I've scrubbed floors, hauled trash, stood in flooded storage rooms. I've seen Elijah cover for missing staff, calm angry residents, and fix things that should have been fixed weeks ago, while you sat behind a desk blaming everyone else." Her mouth opened again, but no words came. "You're being relieved of your duties," Victor said, voice even. "Effective immediately. HR will follow up this afternoon." Beth looked around as if someone might speak up for her. No one did. Victor turned to Elijah. "Are you free tomorrow morning?" Elijah blinked. Yeah?" "Good," Victor said. "We have work to do." The morning after Beth's dismissal, the atmosphere at Westbridge Towers felt palpably different. For the first time in weeks, the front office wasn't thick with tension. Maintenance crews moved with less hesitation, and the phones were answered without sharpness. Victor returned not as Jay, the invisible new hire, but as himself, clean-cut, confident, and carrying a clipboard instead of a mop. Yet, he didn't barricade himself behind the office door. Instead, he made rounds with the team, checking in on every floor, speaking directly to staff and residents alike. He started small, a quiet one-on-one with Mia, the part-time receptionist who had nearly quit a week earlier. "Tell me what you need to do your job better," he asked. She blinked at first, unsure it was a real question, but when she answered, he took notes and followed through. By mid-morning, Victor had held short huddles with custodial, maintenance, and leasing teams, asking the same thing. What's not working, and what would you fix if you could? At lunch, he held an open-floor discussion in the breakroom. No suits, no titles, just people venting real concerns, from broken supply chains to erratic scheduling and hostile oversight. Victor listened, pen scribbling across his notepad, nodding often but never interrupting, and when someone asked, "Are you actually going to do anything with this?" he didn't hesitate. "Yes," he said. "You've been unheard for too long. That changes now." And for the first time, they believed him. By the end of the week, Victor assembled a formal report of Beth's misconduct, 3 verified complaints, 2 HR violations, and a pattern of intimidation corroborated by multiple staff members. He submitted it to the board not as a formality but as a declaration. The days of hands-off leadership were over. Beth, after being given the option of reassignment or termination, chose severance. Her departure was swift and quiet, but the impact rippled through the office. Some employees worried it was only temporary, that someone else just like her would replace her. But Victor had planned for that. He brought in Carla Mendoza, a regional operations specialist with a reputation for steady, ethical leadership. She didn't arrive with speeches or policy binders. She came with a thermos of coffee and an old-fashioned clipboard. On her first day, she shadowed every department, not to observe, but to understand. She asked custodians how long their supply orders had been delayed. She helped the leasing agent troubleshoot outdated software. She sat beside Mia at the reception desk and answered phones, just to feel the rhythm of the lobby. Meanwhile, Victor stayed close, helping implement new systems of transparency, standardized maintenance logs, anonymous employee feedback portals, and a mandatory 24-hour break between long shifts. He made it clear to everyone, leadership would now be measured by how well it supported its people, not how strictly it controlled them. Elijah, now promoted to floor supervisor, received his own office key, not as a symbolic gesture, but because he had earned the trust of the team. Accountability, Victor knew, wasn't about punishment. It was about rebuilding the foundation. And with Carla steering the day-to-day and Elijah growing into a role he never expected, the Westbridge office wasn't just stabilizing, it was transforming. With the immediate crisis addressed, Victor turned his attention to systemic change. The problems at the Westbridge branch hadn't started with Beth, and without deeper reform, they wouldn't end with her either. He began by auditing every internal policy that had gone unexamined for years. The attendance system, once weaponized by management to intimidate staff, was replaced with a humane model that accounted for emergencies, caregiving needs, and mental health breaks. Overtime requests were centralized and monitored to prevent exploitation, and a new cap was instituted to avoid burnout. Most importantly, Victor implemented a rotating leadership review. Each manager would now be assessed anonymously by their teams every quarter, with results tied directly to performance evaluations. He worked closely with Carla and the HR department to introduce a leadership accountability charter, which outlined not only expectations but non-negotiables, like timely maintenance, equitable shift distribution, and zero tolerance for retaliation. Any deviation had to be documented and reported through a new oversight committee made up of employees from multiple branches. Elijah was asked to join as a junior representative, a decision that surprised him but which Victor insisted was overdue. "You speak from the ground up," Victor told him. "That's the voice we've been missing." The overhaul wasn't flashy, and it wasn't perfect, but it was real. Every policy revision was shared in clear language, posted in the break rooms, and discussed during team check-ins. The message was simple. Dignity wasn't a reward. It was right. And from now on, no one, no matter their title, would be allowed to forget that. 2 weeks after stepping into his new mentorship rotation, Noah faced his first true test, not in the form of a major crisis, but something quieter and more telling. During a particularly rainy afternoon, a delivery of high-end equipment parts arrived early at the Westbridge branch. The supervisor was off-site, and the assistant hadn't logged the updated stock checklist yet. As the delivery driver grew agitated about unloading protocol, the rest of the team stood uncertain, unsure whether to step in or wait. Noah, though still technically shadowing, took initiative. He reviewed the manifest, double-checked the space allocation in the receiving bay, and directed 2 junior staffers on proper unloading based on the supplier's guidelines he'd memorized the week prior. The process took 20 minutes, but it avoided a costly return trip fee, and more importantly, it kept the crew from spiraling into finger-pointing and confusion. After the driver left, one of the newer hires muttered, "Didn't think the new guy knew all that." Noah simply smiled and kept organizing the manifest. Later that day, when an internal report flagged the delivery mishap as a potential training gap, it was noted that Noah Singh independently resolved logistics without escalating. Victor saw the report and didn't say much, just forwarded it with the subject line, "Solid start." But inside, he knew. Leadership wasn't about grandstanding. It was about moments like these where someone chose clarity over panic, calm over deflection. Noah hadn't needed to act, but he had. And in doing so, he proved that leadership wasn't just about making decisions. It was about making people feel like someone had their back when it counted. It happened quietly, one late afternoon, as the wind rustled the hedges outside the West Bridge Tech Center. Noah was reviewing safety logs by the front desk when the door chimed, and in walked a familiar figure, the elderly widow from weeks before. She wore the same worn beige coat, but her steps were steadier this time, her posture less burdened. She carried a small white envelope clutched gently in both hands. The receptionist greeted her kindly, but before she could say much, Noah stood up and walked toward her. Their eyes met, and she smiled with instant recognition. "I wasn't sure if you'd still be here," she said softly. "I'm glad you came back," Noah replied. She handed him the envelope. Inside was a handwritten note thanking him for listening, for seeing her, for not rushing her out like everyone else had that day. She explained that after that moment of kindness, she started volunteering at a local support center for bereaved families. "You reminded me that I still matter," the note read, "and that kindness, even in small places, can reroute someone's whole day." Noah read the note in silence, his throat tightening. He looked up and saw Victor across the floor, pausing to watch the exchange. The CO gave him a quiet nod, not of approval, but of understanding. This, more than reports or policies, was the reason they were rebuilding. It had all started with a chair, a kind word, and someone who cared enough to notice. The story of Victor Leung and Noah Pierce teaches us that leadership isn't measured by policies, metrics, or appearances, but by presence, compassion, and the courage to listen. Victor, a CEO who had grown distant from the front line of his tech repair company, learned that behind every customer complaint and staff resignation was a deeper story, one that couldn't be seen from spreadsheets or filtered reports. By stepping into the shoes of an entry-level technician, he uncovered a culture strained by neglect and indifference. But the real heart of the story lies in Noah, a quiet, underappreciated employee who chose kindness when it mattered most. His simple act of compassion toward a grieving widow became the catalyst for change across an entire organization. Through Noah's example, Victor realized that restoring trust doesn't require grand gestures. It starts with small, human moments. The biggest takeaway? Leadership is earned, not claimed. And culture is shaped not by slogans, but by how people treat one another when no one's watching. When a company chooses to center empathy, accountability, and everyday integrity, it doesn't just recover, it begins to thrive. This story reminds us that sometimes the people with the least power teach us the most about what real leadership looks like.